There are moments in the wilderness when a single decision changes two lives forever. When a man running from his past hears a sound that stops him cold, the desperate, broken cry of something small and terrified, begging for mercy it has no reason to expect. For David Mercer, a 47-year-old wildlife photographer, haunted by a tragedy he couldn't prevent. That moment came on a June morning in Yellowstone's backcountry when he found a 3-month-old grizzly bear cub, bloodied and alone, being chased by an entire herd of bison that wanted it dead. What happened next would test every instinct he had about survival, force him to choose between safety and compassion, and ultimately teach him that sometimes saving something fragile is the only way to save yourself. If you want to hear a story about the unbreakable bond between broken souls, hit subscribe right now, because what you're about to hear will stay with you forever. David Mercer hadn't taken a photograph in 8 months. His camera, a Nikon D850 that had captured award-winning images from 6 continents, sat untouched at the bottom of his backpack, wrapped in a wool sweater like something too painful to look at. He'd come to Yellowstone in early June not to work, but to disappear, to walk until his legs gave out and sleep until the dreams stopped coming. Dreams of a school bus, twisted metal, and the face of his daughter Emma pressed against glass he couldn't break through. The accident had been 14 months ago. A patch of black ice on a Montana highway, a driver who overcorrected, and a bus full of children that went over an embankment. Emma was 12. David had been following in his truck, watching it happen in slow motion, helpless. He'd tried everything, smashed windows, pulled on doors that wouldn't budge, screamed until his voice shattered, but the freezing water had risen too fast. 23 children died that day. Emma was number 17 on the list. His wife Claire couldn't look at him anymore. Not with blame, but with shared grief so profound it became a wall between them. The divorce papers came 6 months later, gentle and inevitable. His photography career, built on capturing fleeting moments of beauty and connection, felt like a cruel joke. How could he frame joy when he'd watched his daughter drown? How could he celebrate life when he'd failed to save it, when it mattered most? So he walked, miles and miles through Yellowstone's backcountry, permits scattered across 3 weeks of designated wilderness camping. He avoided other hikers, took trails that didn't exist on maps, and tried to exhaust himself enough that sleep came without memories. This morning he'd been following Pelican Creek, not really seeing the landscape, just putting one foot in front of the other, when he heard it, a sound that cut through his fog like a knife. High-pitched, desperate, terrified, the cry of something young and hurt. David's body reacted before his mind could catch up, 14 months of numbness shattered by pure instinct. He ran toward the sound, crashing through sagebrush and wildflowers, his heart pounding with adrenaline he'd thought was dead. He broke through a line of lodgepole pines into a meadow and stopped cold. A baby grizzly bear, no bigger than a cocker spaniel, was running for its life. Its light brown fur was matted with blood, one ear torn, and it ran with the awkward, desperate stumbling of something pushed beyond exhaustion. Behind it, a massive herd of American bison, at least 40 of them, moved with terrifying purpose. The lead bull, easily 2,000 pounds of muscle and fury, was 20 feet behind the cub and closing fast. David understood immediately what he was seeing. Grizzly bears preyed on bison calves in spring, and the herds remembered. They remembered and they punished. This cub had either been caught trying to hunt, or was being blamed for its mother's crimes. Either way, the bison meant to kill it, and they wouldn't stop until they did. The cub stumbled, rolled, scrambled up. Its eyes, dark and wide with animal terror, locked onto David. And then it did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It changed direction and ran straight toward him, crying out with a sound so human in its desperation that David's chest cracked open. The cub was begging, pleading with the only other creature in the meadow that might possibly help. The bison herd thundered closer, 20 tons of rage bearing down, and David had maybe 3 seconds to decide: run and save himself, or stand his ground for a creature that had no right to ask for mercy and every reason to die alone. David didn't think. He couldn't afford to. The cub was 15 feet away, the bison herd 10 feet behind it, and his body made the choice his broken mind couldn't. He dropped his backpack, ripped off his jacket, and started running straight at the charging bulls, waving the bright red fabric above his head and screaming with every ounce of air in his lungs. "Hey! "Hey, get back!" The lead bull's eyes found him, small, dark, filled with ancient fury. For a horrible moment, David thought the animal would simply run through him, crush him into the wildflower-covered earth without breaking stride. But bison, for all their rage, were still prey animals at heart. The sudden appearance of a human, loud and aggressive, triggered generations of instinct. The bull pulled up short, snorting, pawing the ground. The herd behind him slowed, milled in confusion, their target suddenly protected by something they'd learned to fear. The cub didn't hesitate. It covered the last few feet between them and slammed into David's legs, nearly knocking him over. Tiny claws dug through his jeans as it climbed up his calf, scrambling desperately, crying that heartbreaking sound that was half whimper, half plea. David grabbed the cub with his free hand, warm, trembling, impossibly small, and pressed it against his chest. The bull took a step forward, then another, its massive head lowered, showing David the curved black horns that could gut him in a single motion. The rest of the herd spread out in a semicircle, cutting off any escape route. David's mind flashed to Emma, to the last moment he'd seen her alive, her small hand pressed against the bus window, and he understood with perfect clarity that he was about to die in this meadow protecting something that wasn't even his to save. But he didn't run. He stood his ground, one arm holding a terrified bear cub, the other waving his jacket like a matador, facing down certain death. And he screamed at the bison with all the rage and grief and helplessness he'd been carrying for 14 months. "Not today. Not this one. You don't get this one." The bull stopped. Its dark eyes studied him with unsettling intelligence, calculating, deciding. David could smell it, wild and earthy, the scent of pure animal power. His legs shook. The cub buried its face in his armpit, its rapid heartbeat vibrating against his ribs. Then, impossibly, the bull turned. Just slightly, but enough. It snorted once more, a sound like distant thunder, and began moving away. The herd followed slowly at first, then with increasing speed, flowing around David and the cub like water around stone. Within 30 seconds they were gone, their hoofbeats fading into the vast wilderness, leaving only crushed grass and the lingering smell of danger. David's legs gave out. He collapsed to his knees, still clutching the cub, his whole body shaking with adrenaline crash. The jacket fell from his hand. For several long moments he just knelt there, breathing hard, trying to process that he was alive, that they were both alive. The cub shifted against him and made a different sound, softer, questioning. David looked down and found himself staring into dark brown eyes that held too much awareness for comfort. The cub's muzzle was covered in dried blood, not its own. One ear was torn nearly in half, the wound fresh and ugly. Its left front paw hung at an odd angle, possibly broken. It was a mess, traumatized and hurt, and it was looking at David like he was the answer to a question it didn't know how to ask. "Where's your mother?" David whispered, though he already knew the answer. Cubs this young didn't wander alone unless something terrible had happened. The cub just pressed closer, trembling, and David felt something crack open inside his chest. Something that had been frozen solid since the accident, warming by painful degrees. This wasn't Emma, this wasn't even human, but it was small and scared and hurt, and it needed him in a way nothing had needed him since he'd failed his daughter. His hands were still shaking as he carefully examined the cub's injuries. The torn ear would heal on its own, but the paw worried him, and there was blood in the cub's fur that suggested other wounds he couldn't see. It needed help, real help, from people who knew what they were doing. David pulled out his satellite phone, required equipment for backcountry permits, and stared at it. The right thing to do was obvious. Call the ranger station, report an orphaned cub, let wildlife services handle it. They'd either rehabilitate it, or more likely, given its age and injuries, euthanize it humanely. Clean, professional, by the book. His finger hovered over the call button. The cub made that soft questioning sound again, and placed one tiny paw on his hand, claws retracted. Impossibly trusting, David put the phone away. "Just for tonight," he told the cub. Told himself, knowing even as he said it that he was lying. "Just until I figure out what to do." The cub's response was to curl up in his lap and close its eyes. Exhausted and hurting, but finally, impossibly, safe. And David Mercer, who hadn't felt anything but grief for 14 months, felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, like coming home. David set up camp 2 miles from the meadow, in a dense grove of spruce trees near a cold stream. His hands moved automatically through tasks he'd done 1,000 times: tent stakes, sleeping bag, water purification, but his mind was somewhere else entirely, focused on the tiny creature that refused to leave his side. The cub followed him everywhere, limping badly on its injured paw, making soft huffing sounds whenever David moved more than a few feet away. It was behavior that should have been impossible. Wild grizzly bears, even cubs, avoided humans with deep instinct. But this cub acted like David was its last anchor, in a world that had turned savage and incomprehensible. When David sat down to assess supplies, the cub climbed into his lap immediately, settling there with the confidence of something that belonged. Its weight was maybe 20 pounds, its fur still carrying the lighter coloring of extreme youth. Up close, David could see more details of its ordeal. Claw marks across its shoulder, likely from its own mother, defending it from the bison before being killed. A deep gash along its ribs that would need attention, and those eyes constantly seeking his face, asking questions he had no language to answer. "You're going to need a name," David said quietly, surprised by the sound of his own voice. He hadn't spoken to anything living in days. "Can't just keep calling you Cub." The bear made a chirping sound, almost bird-like, and pawed at his shirt pocket where he kept trail mix. David pulled out a handful of nuts and dried berries, offering them carefully. The cub sniffed, then ate with desperate hunger, its small teeth clicking against his palm. When the food was gone, it looked up at him expectantly. "Atlas," David said suddenly, the name arriving fully formed, "because you're carrying something way too heavy for how small you are." Atlas seemed satisfied with this, or at least satisfied with the gentle tone. The cub pressed its head against David's chest and made a rumbling sound that wasn't quite a purr but spoke the same language of contentment. David spent the next hour cleaning Atlas's wounds with purified water and the first aid supplies from his pack. The cub flinched and whimpered, but didn't try to bite, just gripped David's sleeve with its good paw and endured. The torn ear was the worst, ragged and dirty, already showing signs of infection. David applied antibiotic ointment and wrapped it as best he could with gauze, knowing it was inadequate but better than nothing. The paw concerned him most. Atlas couldn't put weight on it, and when David gently probed the leg, the cub cried out in pain. Not broken, he decided, but badly sprained or dislocated. He fashioned a makeshift splint from 2 straight sticks and medical tape, working slowly while Atlas watched with those impossibly trusting eyes. "This is temporary," David said as he worked, needing to say it aloud. "Tomorrow I'm calling the Rangers. They'll know what to do. They have facilities, veterinarians, protocols for situations like this." But even as he spoke, doubt gnawed at him. He'd photographed enough wildlife rehabilitation to know the statistics. Orphaned grizzly cubs this young, especially injured ones, were rarely candidates for release back into the wild. They were either sent to zoos, a lifetime of concrete and crowds, or euthanized as the more humane option. Atlas was too young to survive alone, too injured to keep up with adoptive mothers, even if they could find one, and too habituated to humans now after what had happened in the meadow. The sun was setting, painting the spruce grove in shades of amber and gold. David heated water for dehydrated soup, while Atlas dozed against his leg, occasionally twitching in dreams that were probably nightmares. When the food was ready, David ate mechanically, tasting nothing, his mind churning through impossible choices. He thought about Emma, about the last morning before the field trip, how she'd hugged him tight and said, "Love you," Dad without him having to prompt her first, how he'd been too distracted checking his camera equipment to really hug her back, to make that moment count the way it deserved, how he'd spent 14 months replaying that morning, rewriting it in his head 1,000 different ways. Atlas shifted in sleep and made a small, distressed sound. Without thinking, David reached down and stroked the cub's head, his fingers gentle between the rounded ears. Atlas settled immediately, pressing into the touch, and David felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. "I don't know what I'm doing," he whispered to the darkening forest. "I couldn't save her. How am I supposed to save you?" Atlas didn't answer, just breathed steadily against his leg, alive and warm and dependent on choices David wasn't qualified to make. In the distance, a wolf howled, a sound that reminded David they weren't safe here, that the wilderness was full of things that viewed a baby grizzly bear as food. and that keeping Atlas alive through even one night might be harder than he'd imagined. He pulled the cub closer as full darkness fell, and for the first time in 14 months, David Mercer felt something other than grief. He felt purpose, terrifying and consuming, and he wasn't sure if it would save him or destroy him completely. David woke at dawn to find Atlas gone. His heart seized with panic as he bolted upright in his sleeping bag, scanning the campsite with wild eyes. Then he heard it, splashing from the stream 20 feet away. Atlas stood in the shallows, balancing awkwardly on 3 legs, attempting to catch a small trout that darted around its clumsy swipes. The cub's makeshift splint was soaked through, hanging loose, but the look of fierce concentration on its face was almost comical. "Atlas," David called softly. The cub's head snapped toward him immediately, and David watched something remarkable happen. Atlas's entire body language changed, from focused predator to relieved child in an instant. The cub abandoned the fish and scrambled toward him through the water, crying out with obvious joy, as if they'd been separated for days instead of minutes. "Easy, easy," David murmured as Atlas crashed into him, soaking wet and vibrating with excitement. "You're supposed to be resting that paw." But even as he said it, David noticed something encouraging. Atlas was putting slight weight on the injured leg now, just for balance. The swelling had gone down overnight, and the cub's movements seemed less pained. Young animals healed fast. It was one of nature's mercies. The wounds were still serious, but maybe, just maybe, not life-threatening. David reapplied the splint with fresh materials, then heated water for instant coffee. As it brewed, he pulled out the satellite phone and stared at it for the 3rd time since waking. His thumb traced the emergency call button. One call, that's all it would take. Rangers would be here by afternoon, professionals who dealt with situations like this regularly. They'd take Atlas, fill out paperwork, make the decisions David was too broken to make himself. He was still staring at the phone when he heard voices. Male voices, multiple coming from the trail he'd crossed yesterday. David's body tensed. Backcountry hikers were common enough, but something in the tone made his photographer's instincts kick in. These weren't tourists admiring scenery. They were searching for something. Tracks headed this direction, definitely fresh, one voice said, closer than David liked. "Cub can't have gone far with that injured paw." David's blood ran cold. He looked down at Atlas, who was chewing contentedly on a piece of beef jerky, completely oblivious. Then back toward the voices. "Fish and Wildlife wants it alive if possible," another voice responded. "Orphaned cubs are valuable for the research program. They can track its adaptation patterns, study trauma responses, see how early separation from mothers affects—" Yeah, I read the brief," the first voice cut in, impatient. "I'm just saying if it runs, we use the tranks. Director Chen's been trying to secure funding for this program for 3 years. A young, injured, semi-habituated cub is exactly what she needs." David felt his stomach drop. These weren't rangers doing rescue. This was wildlife research looking for a test subject. He knew enough about those programs from his photography work. Well-intentioned scientists who viewed animals as data points, who'd spend years studying Atlas's trauma in controlled environments, measuring its fear responses, testing its ability to form attachments, all in the name of conservation science. Atlas would live. But it would live in a research facility, poked and prodded and studied, its entire existence reduced to graphs and papers and grant applications. The voices were getting closer. David could see movement now through the trees. 2 figures in Fish and Wildlife Service uniforms, carrying equipment bags and what looked like tranquilizer rifles. They were maybe 200 yards away, following Atlas's tracks from yesterday, the bloody paw prints and disturbed vegetation that led straight to this camp. David had maybe 3 minutes before they arrived. 3 minutes to decide whether to surrender Atlas to people who'd view it as a lucky research opportunity, or to do something incredibly stupid. Atlas looked up at him with those dark, trusting eyes and made a soft, questioning sound. David thought about Emma, about how many times he'd followed rules, done the right thing, deferred to authorities and professionals, and how none of it had mattered when it counted. How he'd watched his daughter die because he couldn't break through bureaucratic safety glass, because protocol said the emergency services would handle it, because he'd trusted that the system would save her. The system had let her drown. He wasn't going to let the system take Atlas. David moved fast. He threw gear into his backpack without bothering to organize, grabbed Atlas under one arm despite the cub's confused protests, and headed in the opposite direction from the voices. Not toward the main trails where they'd expect him to run, but deeper into the backcountry, toward the thermal areas where the terrain got dangerous and unpredictable, where professionals with protocol wouldn't follow without serious cause. Someone's here. The tracks lead to a campsite. David ran, holding Atlas tight against his chest, feeling the cub's rapid heartbeat matching his own. Behind him, voices shouted in confusion and then coordination. Sir, this is Fish and Wildlife. We need to talk to you about that bear." But David was already gone, crashing through underbrush, heading for the one place he knew they couldn't easily follow, the thermal basin where the earth was thin and unstable, where one wrong step meant breaking through to boiling water below, where only a crazy person would take an injured bear cub. Atlas clung to him, claws digging in but not piercing, trusting completely that wherever David was taking them was safe. David just hoped he was right, because he'd just made a choice that would either save them both or destroy any chance Atlas had at a normal life, and there was no going back now. The thermal basin was a nightmare landscape of hissing steam vents, bubbling mud pots, and mineral deposits that painted the ground in unnatural shades of yellow and orange. David knew this area from a photography expedition 5 years ago, before Emma, before everything fell apart. He'd captured stunning images of the alien terrain, but he'd also noted in his journal that it was one of the most dangerous places in Yellowstone. The earth here was deceptive, stable-looking ground that could give way without warning to superheated water just inches below. But it was also a place where tracking became impossible. The steam obscured thermal imaging, the mineral crust showed no footprints, and the constant geological activity meant rangers would never risk following a civilian into the heart of it. David picked his way carefully, testing each step before committing his weight, holding Atlas close while the cub's nose twitched at the sulfur smell. He found shelter in a small cave formed by an ancient lava flow, set back from the active thermal features but hidden by the perpetual steam. It wasn't much, barely enough room for his tent, but it was concealed and relatively safe. David set Atlas down and immediately checked the cub's injuries. The splint had held miraculously, and though Atlas was panting from stress, there was no new damage. "We're okay," David said, trying to convince himself as much as the cub. "We're okay." But they weren't okay, and David knew it. He'd just fled from federal wildlife officials, effectively kidnapping a protected species, and taken refuge in one of the most hazardous locations in the park. His satellite phone had no signal here, too much geological interference. His food would last maybe 4 days. And Atlas needed more than beef jerky and stream water. The cub needed proper nutrition, medical attention, a plan that extended beyond blind panic. What had he done? Atlas seemed oblivious to the crisis, exploring the small cave with cautious curiosity, sniffing at rocks and pawing at David's backpack. When David sat down heavily against the cave wall, overwhelmed by the magnitude of his choices, Atlas immediately climbed into his lap and pressed its head under his chin. The gesture was so trusting, so completely dependent, that David felt his eyes burn with tears he'd thought were long exhausted. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Atlas's fur. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what I'm doing. I couldn't save my daughter, and now I'm going to get you killed trying. To save you from people who actually know how to help." Atlas made a soft rumbling sound and licked his jaw, a gesture of comfort that shattered something fundamental in David's chest. He wrapped his arms around the cub and cried for the first time since Emma's funeral. Cried for his daughter, for his marriage, for the career he'd abandoned, for the man he used to be before grief hollowed him out. And he cried for Atlas, this impossible creature who'd run to him for help and gotten a broken man with no plan and failing courage. He cried until he was empty, until the tears stopped, and all that remained was exhausted clarity. And in that clarity, David understood something he'd been avoiding for 14 months. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't save Emma. He couldn't undo that moment of helplessness on the highway. But he could choose what happened next. He could decide whether Atlas's story ended in a research facility or something better. The question was, what was better? What did saving Atlas actually look like? His hand found his phone, and though there was no signal, he scrolled through old photos he hadn't been able to delete. Emma feeding ducks at a pond. Emma holding a caterpillar she'd found, her face lit with wonder. Emma asleep in the car after a long hike, trusting completely that her father would get her home safe. Trust. That's what Atlas had given him in that meadow. What the cub continued to give him, every time it looked into his eyes. And trust demanded more than David running on grief and impulse. It demanded that he figure out a real solution. He thought about wildlife rehabilitation centers, not government facilities, but private sanctuaries he'd photographed over the years. Places run by people who cared more about individual animals than research data. There was one in Montana, maybe 3 hours from the park's north entrance. A woman named Sarah Brightwater, who'd devoted her life to bears, who'd raised orphaned cubs and successfully released them when possible, who just might take a chance on Atlas. But getting there meant leaving the park, which meant crossing ranger stations where his face would be flagged in the system. It meant traveling with an illegal bear cub, risking arrest, potentially losing Atlas to confiscation anyway. The odds were terrible, yet they were better than hiding in a thermal basin until his supplies ran out. David looked down at Atlas, who'd fallen asleep in his lap, breathing steadily, one small paw resting on his arm. The cub's torn ear was already scabbing over. The splintered paw showed continued improvement. Against all odds, Atlas was healing. Maybe David could too. Okay, he said quietly to the sleeping cub. Okay, tomorrow we're leaving. We're going to walk out of this park, and I'm going to find someone who can actually help you. And if they arrest me, if they take you away, at least I'll know I tried. At least I'll know I didn't just give up. Atlas shifted in sleep, pressing closer, and David held the cub through the long afternoon, while steam rose around their hiding place, and somewhere out in the basin. Rangers called his name, their voices echoing off stone and water, searching for a man and a bear that didn't want to be found. But tomorrow, David decided, they'd stop hiding. Tomorrow they'd fight for something better than survival. Tomorrow they'd both start healing. David waited until nightfall before moving. The thermal basin cooled slightly after sunset, the steam less dense, the rangers' voices finally fading as they withdrew to safer ground. He packed in darkness, working by feel while Atlas stayed pressed against his side, sensing the tension. The journey north would take 2 days on foot through backcountry, longer with an injured cub. David plotted a route that avoided main trails and ranger stations, old game paths and ridgelines, that would be brutal on his legs, but offered the best chance of staying undetected. He'd have to move mostly at night, rest during the day when helicopters might spot them. It was risky, exhausting, and probably impossible, but he was doing it anyway. They left the thermal basin under a quarter moon, David's headlamp turned off to avoid detection. Atlas walked beside him, limping but determined, the splint still holding. The cub had grown stronger in just 2 days, testament to youth's resilience. But David knew the journey ahead would push those limits. He carried Atlas whenever the terrain got too steep, feeling the cub's weight against his chest. The steady heartbeat that reminded him why he was risking everything. 3 hours into their hike, they encountered the first real obstacle, a narrow ridge with steep drop-offs on both sides, the only path forward unless they backtracked 5 miles. David tested the ground carefully, his boots finding purchase on loose shale. Atlas hesitated at the edge, whimpering. "I've got you," David said, scooping the cub into his arms. "I won't let you fall." He crossed the ridge slowly, every step deliberate, remembering his climbing training from years ago. The void yawned on both sides, the moon casting just enough light to show the deadly drop. Halfway across, loose rock shifted under his boot. David's heart lurched, his balance wavering, but he adjusted and kept moving. Atlas buried its face in his jacket, trusting completely. They made it across. David's legs shook with adrenaline as he set Atlas down on solid ground, and the cub immediately pressed against him, making soft sounds of relief. 6 more miles tonight, David told him. Then we rest. But 4 miles later, just as dawn began to gray the eastern sky, David heard the helicopter. It came from the south, flying low, sweeping search patterns with a powerful spotlight. David and Atlas were exposed on an open slope, nowhere to hide. The helicopter may be 2 minutes from spotting them. David's mind raced. Running would only draw attention. Standing still meant certain detection. He did the only thing he could think of. He pulled Atlas under him, covering the cub's light-colored fur with his own dark jacket and body, and pressed flat against the rocky ground. The spotlight swept closer, its white beam turning night to day, the rotor wash bending nearby bushes. David held his breath, feeling Atlas's rapid heartbeat against his stomach, both of them frozen like prey under a predator's gaze. The light passed over them, lingered. David's pulse hammered in his ears. Then, impossibly, the helicopter banked away, continuing its search pattern toward the thermal basin, where they'd been yesterday. David didn't move for 10 full minutes after the sound faded. When he finally rolled off Atlas, his whole body was shaking. The cub crawled out, looking shaken but unhurt, and licked David's face with obvious concern. Too close, David breathed. Way too close. They found shelter in a dense pine grove as the sun fully rose. David set up a cold camp, no fire that might give away their position, and rationed out food. Atlas ate eagerly, still hungry, still growing despite everything. David chewed on trail mix without tasting it, his mind calculating distances and odds. 20 miles to the park boundary, another 10 to where he'd left his truck at a trailhead parking area. If the truck hadn't been impounded, if rangers weren't watching it, if he could somehow make it there with Atlas undetected, he could drive to Sarah Brightwater's sanctuary in 3 hours. Too many ifs. But it was the only plan he had. Atlas curled up against him as morning light filtered through the pines. The cub's breathing slowed, sleep coming easily despite their ordeal. David envied that resilience, that ability to trust that tomorrow would work out because someone bigger had promised to try. He pulled out his phone, still no signal, and looked again at Emma's photos. His daughter would be 14 now if she'd lived, would be rolling her eyes at his jokes, fighting for independence, growing into whoever she was meant to become. He'd never get to see that person. But he could see Atlas grow, could give this one small life the chance Emma never got. I'm going to get you there, David promised the sleeping cub. Whatever it takes, I'm going to get you somewhere safe. Atlas's ear twitched in sleep, the torn one already healing at the edges, and David let himself hope, fragile and terrifying, that maybe, just maybe, they'd both make it through this. They slept through the day while helicopters searched in the distance, and when night fell again, they continued north. Two broken souls moving through darkness towards something that might be salvation or might be the end of everything. Either way, they were moving forward. And after 14 months of standing still, that felt like a kind of miracle. The truck was still there. David almost couldn't believe it. When they emerged from the forest at 3 a.m. and found his dusty Ford F-150 sitting alone in the trailhead parking lot, exactly where he'd left it 9 days ago. No rangers waiting, no roadblocks, just his truck and a dark highway stretching north toward Montana. He loaded Atlas into the passenger seat, where the cub immediately curled up on the worn upholstery, exhausted from 2 nights of hard travel. David's hands trembled as he turned the key. The engine roared to life, and he half expected sirens, spotlights, orders to stop. But there was only silence and the empty road. He drove through the night with the radio off, checking his mirrors obsessively, expecting every set of headlights behind him to be park rangers or state police. Atlas slept through most of it, occasionally waking to make soft questioning sounds before settling back down. The cub trusted him completely. David prayed that trust wasn't misplaced. Dawn found them crossing into Montana, and David finally allowed himself to breathe. He stopped at a gas station outside of Bozeman, filled the tank, and made the call he'd been rehearsing in his head for 2 days. Sarah Brightwater answered on the 3rd ring, her voice thick with sleep. "This better be important. Sarah, it's David Mercer. We worked together on that Grizzly rehabilitation piece for National Geographic about 6 years ago." A pause. "David, I heard you'd—" "I'm sorry about your daughter. I wanted to reach out, but I need help," David cut in, his voice cracking. "I have an orphaned grizzly cub, 3 months old, injured, imprinted on me. I know what I'm about to tell you sounds insane, but I need you to listen." He told her everything. The bison chase, the rescue, the fish and wildlife researchers, his decision to run. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when David finished, the silence stretched so long he thought she'd hung up. "You stole a federally protected animal," she finally said. No, you fled law enforcement. No, You crossed state lines with illegal wildlife. Sarah, I know. But if you could see him, if you could see how he looks at me. David's voice broke completely. I couldn't let them put him in a lab. I couldn't save my daughter, but maybe I can save him. Please, I'll take full responsibility. I'll turn myself in, face whatever charges they want. Just please take Atlas and give him a real chance. Another long silence. Then bring him to the sanctuary. Service entrance, not the main gate. I'll meet you there in 2 hours. And David? You better hope I don't regret this. The Brightwater Bear Sanctuary sat on 200 acres of protected Montana wilderness, a place David had photographed years ago when his life still made sense. Sarah met him at the service entrance as promised, her silver hair pulled back, her weathered face unreadable. She was 63, had worked with bears for 40 years, and took no nonsense from anyone. She looked at Atlas through the truck window, and her expression softened immediately. "Oh, you poor baby," she murmured. Then to David, "Get him inside, quickly." The sanctuary's veterinary clinic was better equipped than David had dared hope. Dr. Michael Chen, no relation to the researcher whose video David had found, examined Atlas with gentle competence while Sarah and David watched. The cub whimpered during the exam, constantly looking back at David for reassurance, and every sound stabbed David's heart. "Torn ear is healing well," Dr. Chen reported. "The paw was a sprain already mostly recovered. He's underweight and dehydrated, but nothing critical. This cub's been incredibly lucky." He paused, meeting David's eyes. "Or incredibly well cared for. Can you help him?" David asked. "We can do more than that," Sarah said quietly. "We can give him a life. Not in the wild. He's too habituated now, too young to have learned proper survival behaviors from his mother. But here, with space to roam, other bears to socialize with dignity and respect. It's not freedom, but it's the next best thing." David felt his knees weaken with relief. What about the authorities? Fish and Wildlife will be looking for him. Sarah's expression hardened. "Let them look. This sanctuary operates independently, and we have legal protections for animals in our care. If they want Atlas, they'll need court orders, which means proving ownership and intent. That takes time, lawyers, and bureaucratic will that usually runs out when dealing with one orphaned cub." She looked at David carefully. "But you're another story. You broke federal laws. I can protect the bear, but I can't protect you." "I don't need protection," David said. "I need him to be safe." What David didn't expect was what came next. Sarah made calls to lawyers, to wildlife advocacy groups, to journalists who'd covered her work before. Within 24 hours, Atlas's story had gone public. Not as a case of wildlife theft, but as a question of ethics. What do we owe animals we've made vulnerable? What happens when protocol conflicts with compassion? The media response was overwhelming. Photos of Atlas, taken by David during their journey, showing the cub's injuries and trust, went viral. Public pressure mounted. People who'd never thought about wildlife policy suddenly had opinions about what should happen to one small bear and the broken man who'd saved him. The federal charges came, as expected. But so did something unexpected, a deal. If David agreed to community service, to sharing his story as part of wildlife education programs, to working with Sarah's sanctuary on proper human-bear interaction protocols, the government would drop the most serious charges. Atlas would remain at Brightwater permanently. No research facility, no euthanasia. A life sentence at the sanctuary, but a life nonetheless. David took the deal without hesitation. 6 months later, David stood outside Atlas's enclosure watching the cub, now 60 pounds and growing fast, wrestle with another young bear Sarah had rescued. Atlas's ear had healed into a distinctive notch that made him easy to identify. The paw showed no lasting damage, and though the cub had bonded with other bears and was learning to be a bear, every time David visited, Atlas would break away from whatever he was doing to rush to the fence, standing on hind legs, making that same soft huffing sound that meant recognition, meant connection, meant "I remember you." "He's thriving," Sarah said, joining David at the fence, integrated with the other juveniles, eating well, showing normal development. "You did good, David." "I broke about 15 laws," David replied, but he was smiling slightly. "Sometimes the right thing and the legal thing aren't the same." Sarah paused. "Your community service proposal, the photography workshops for at-risk youth. using wildlife connection as therapy for grief. The board approved it. If you're still interested, David watched Atlas play, watched the joy and resilience in every movement. Emma loved animals, he said quietly. She used to make me stop the car whenever she saw anything on the road, turtles, rabbits, even worms after rain. She'd spend hours relocating them to safety. His voice caught. I couldn't save her, but maybe I can teach other kids that broken things deserve a chance to heal. That sometimes saving something else is how we save ourselves. Sarah put a weathered hand on his shoulder. She'd be proud of you. David pulled out his camera for the first time in 14 months. Not the expensive Nikon, but his phone, simple and functional. Through the lens, he framed Atlas against the Montana sky, healthy, safe, alive. He took the photo, and for once it didn't hurt to capture beauty. It felt like promise, like beginning again. Atlas caught sight of the camera and posed, standing tall, as if he understood the importance of being witnessed, of having his story told, of proving that sometimes the most broken people and the most vulnerable creatures find each other exactly when they need to. And in saving each other, discover that healing is possible after all. David lowered the camera and whispered, "Thank you." He wasn't sure if he was talking to Atlas or Emma, or the universe that had put a desperate bear cub and a grieving father in the same meadow on a June morning. Maybe it didn't matter. Maybe what mattered was that he'd shown up. That when something small and hurt had run to him for help, he'd chosen compassion over protocol, connection over grief, and in doing so had found the first real reason to keep living he'd felt since the accident. Atlas returned to playing, and David stayed until sunset, watching, documenting, slowly rebuilding himself one photograph at a time. The road ahead was long. The loss of Emma would never fully heal. But for the first time in 14 months, David Mercer believed he might survive it. More than survive, he might actually find meaning again, all because a baby grizzly bear had looked at him and decided he was worth trusting. And because for once in his broken life, David had been brave enough to try. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that healing is possible even in our darkest moments, leave a comment sharing your own story of unexpected hope. And if you believe in second chances, for people, for animals, for all of us carrying grief we can't name, hit that subscribe button, because the world is full of broken things that refuse to stay broken, and their stories deserve to be told. Thank you for listening. See you in the next one.